Is this on? Hello. Sorry to interrupt your lunch, but thank you all for coming out. I'm George Thomas, a professor of government here at Claremont, McKenna, and I confess, actually, I'm a little bit reluctant to cut this short right now and introduce Professor Jean Yarbrough, as we were just being regaled with tales of her course Eros and Politics, right? Is that right, Jean? Where there was much drinking of wine and watching of Sex in the City with students, sprawled out on her bed until 3 a.m. So she might not be as straight and narrow as you think. And we even learned that Charles Kessler has seen a few episodes of Sex in the City himself, which I find almost as shocking as Jean Yarbrough sprawled out on her bed at 3 a.m. with her students watching Sex in the City. So, but on a more serious note, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Yarbrough here. She's an old friend of many of us. She is a longtime professor at Bowdoin College, where she teaches courses in American political thought and political theory. She is the author of 2 excellent works. I've actually even brought mine so she can sign them. One, American Virtues, Thomas Jefferson and the Character of a Free People, and to the topic she's going to be speaking on today, Theodore Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition, which also was the winner of the American Political Science Association's Richard Neustadt Book Award. And on a personal note, I want to say it's a particular pleasure to have Professor Yarbrough here, because I remember her fondly, along with her late husband, Dick Morgan, from New England and the New England Political Science Conference, both as a graduate student and then as a young assistant professor at Williams College. I remember going to the meetings, and there were these very distinguished older professors, Professor Morgan, Professor Yarbrough, and they were always so inviting. They actually attended to you as a graduate student, listened to what you had to say. I remember actually her late husband in particular being on, I think, my first panel ever, and giving a talk as a graduate student. And then he asks questions and talks to you afterward and treats you actually like a colleague. And they were so welcoming, and it was such a great atmosphere to come up as first a graduate student and then as a young assistant professor at the time. So it's a particular pleasure that I get to have Professor Yarbrough out. So please join me in welcoming Jean Yarbrough.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, George, for your humorous introduction and your many references to the demographic to which I belong. I'd like to also thank the Government Department and the Salvatore Institute for making this visit possible. It is a particular pleasure to be in Southern California. When I was leaving Maine on Thursday and flying through Kennedy in New York, we had to wait on the runway while the plane was de-iced. Spring will come to Maine, but probably not until Memorial Day this year. We are buried in snow, so it's beautiful to see the jacaranda in bloom and just to see the green and see the bugs. Even the bugs are a welcome sight. Last night I had dinner with other people besides George, and one of them was Susan McWilliams, whose late father was a dear friend of mine and a mentor, even though we did not agree politically on very much. But on this Sex in the City theme, I thought I would tell you also that Carrie McWilliams was such a wonderful man that I remember being at a conference with him one time at Wake Forest, and I had a big martini in my hand, and he said, "Come on into my room." And I did, and I sprawled out on the bed with him. And the two of us talked about politics and philosophy, and that was it. Really, there are just a lot of great stories to be told. Here is one that Susan shared with me last night. I didn't know that Theodore Roosevelt had visited Pomona College, but he did in 1903, and Susan sent me the link to it this morning. Pearson's Hall served memorably as the site of an address in May 1903 by President Theodore Roosevelt, whom Pomona President George Gates had invited, hoping to enhance the college's visibility and reputation. Arriving at the Claremont train station, Roosevelt was transported by carriage to campus, he was president then, where he spoke to a throng of 7,000 to 8,000 from a rostrum constructed in front of Pearson's, later planting a California live oak nearby to mark the occasion. The tree, alas, died soon after, though college lore attached the Roosevelt name to succeeding oaks. Did you know that? Okay, good. Well, I hope I can tell you a few other things you may not know. My talk today will focus on two related aspects of Roosevelt's political thought. I'll try to just walk you very briefly through his stewardship theory of the presidency, and then conclude with a short discussion of his larger progressive vision, emerging first in the latter years of his presidency and culminating in his Bull Moose run for the presidency, challenging the incumbent Republican William Howard Taft, whom he had helped to install in the White House in 1909. The stewardship theory. So I'll begin there, and what I will do is give you three examples of Roosevelt's stewardship theory. Although no modern president would explicitly cite Theodore Roosevelt's stewardship theory of executive power, most of them secretly practice it. So what is it? Roosevelt, in his autobiography, explained it in the following way. His autobiography was written in 1913 after he had lost his bid for the presidency, running in a three-way race against William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And we have our Woodrow Wilson expert here, so I won't say anything more about him. This is how Roosevelt described the stewardship theory. Occasionally, great national crises arise which call for immediate and vigorous action, and that in such cases it is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people, and that the proper attitude for him to take is that he is bound to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid him to do it. So I will give you three examples of how Roosevelt acted on the stewardship theory while he was president, keeping in mind that he didn't actually name the theory on which he was operating until after he had left the White House. Although it was developed while he was there, he just didn't name it. The most famous of the three examples is the anthracite coal strike of 1902. This was a real problem in the Northeast, again, threatened with the onset of winter, and perhaps even worse than the approach of winter was the approach of the midterm elections in November of 1902. And Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to Roosevelt and said, something has to be done. Otherwise, we're really going to get a shellacking, a whooping in the midterm elections. If you can't do anything, can you at least appear to be doing something? Well, I mean, Roosevelt was never content with appearing to do something, and so he took action. And the first thing that he did was to invite the coal managers and the leaders of the coal miners union to a meeting in Washington at the White House. And this was the first time that the president had used the prestige of his office to try to settle a labor dispute. And in the end, it worked out successfully. But Roosevelt had a plan B. And the plan B was that if his negotiations failed, he was prepared to use the army to go in and seize the mines and operate them for the public good until the crisis had passed and there was a resolution to the strike. And that is the part, it's the plan B that really shows you the extent, the fullness of his understanding of his stewardship theory of the presidency. Where was the constitutional warrant for seizing private property and operating it by the government until the emergency had passed? He was asked this question, and he basically said, the people demand it, the people need it, therefore I have the power to do it. Later on, when he actually tried to defend this again in his autobiography in 1913, Roosevelt claimed that he was following the model of Andrew Jackson, which is a somewhat strange model for him, but mostly of Abraham Lincoln. And this is a model of energetic executives who construed their powers broadly. It also had a kind of psychological dimension in that Roosevelt thought that these were vigorous men. These were men who were not afraid to take action. They were not those weak, timid souls who cowered and shrank from their responsibilities. He was no shirker. He was no shrinker. So there was that additional dimension. But there were major differences between Lincoln's broad use of executive power during the Civil War and what Roosevelt was doing. And I'll just briefly mention what these are and probably oversimplify. I do go into this at some detail in my book, but obviously I can't spell out all those arguments, and they're better read than talked at anyway. Lincoln cited constitutional provisions for the exercise of broad powers by citing specific constitutional clauses that he read that empowered him. For instance, his oath, his commander-in-chief power. He didn't just say, nobody's stopping me from doing this, therefore I have the power to do it, and it's what the people want. He did not claim, Lincoln did not claim broad authority to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, especially the needs of the nation as they were articulated by the new journals and women's magazines who helped to bring the progressive political message to the forefront of American public opinion. When Lincoln did take measures that arguably exceeded his constitutional powers, he did so as commander-in-chief on the basis of indispensable necessity. And closely related to this, Abraham Lincoln was engaged in an actual civil war. By contrast, TR did not try to defend his actions in the coal strike by citing the Constitution, ever. As one wag put it, TR had no more use for the Constitution than a tomcat has for a marriage license, while we're on this sex theme. Within a year, he was describing his actions without any reference to the Constitution whatsoever, claiming instead that he was the head of the nation, and as such, he obeyed a supreme law of duty to the Republic. Where this supreme law of duty came from, he did not say. For TR, this was all a matter of character and temperament. A crisis was at hand. Something had to be done. It was as if we were at war. And the as if is important. The second of these moments, these stewardship moments during his presidency, and there are more than three, but I've chosen three that I think are interesting and also to some extent illustrative of issues that face the country today, continue to face it. The second was the conservation movement. And those of you who are from the West and certainly out here at Claremont, you know what a devoted leader Roosevelt was of all conservation movements, land reclamation, water, hydroelectric power, forest reserves, and so on and so forth. It's especially important all over the West. And it was, in fact, his friends in the conservation movement who first developed the idea that the president was the steward of the nation's natural resources. And Roosevelt, of course, expanded the understanding of natural resources to include human resources. If you've ever wondered what that Department of Human Resources, where it came from, the first use of it was by Theodore Roosevelt. Human resources. If we're going to save trees, if we're going to save historic and geographic land sites of significance, then certainly we need to think about preserving human resources. Therefore, we need to regulate labor conditions and so on and so forth. And so you see what a protean concept the conservation movement became. And one of the things that I try to show in my book is that Roosevelt began his presidency with a bunch of piecemeal conservation efforts. Well, here was land reclamation, and here was water policy, and here was the forestry. And by the end, starting in 1907, this had all congealed into the conservation movement, which Roosevelt made the great moral issue of the day. And so the conservation movement came out of discrete and particular conservation efforts. And Roosevelt thought that this was really a wonderful way to mobilize public opinion in back of his policies. And once again, he said that next to war, this was the issue that would really excite the American people and get them to move forward with the program that he wanted. Of course, he was thwarted in a lot of these proposals that he put forth, and so he discovered creative ways to try to circumvent them. He found ways to enact his conservation policies without having to go through Congress. For instance, he increasingly relied on presidential commissions, and one of the things that I discovered in looking at these presidential commissions run out of his office, which Congress refused to fund then, is that Gifford Pinchot was on every single one of them. Gifford Pinchot, whose family then had made a fortune in lumbering, and then went on to become the head of the Forest Service. The use of presidential commissions to formulate policy that would be independent of Congress, and executive orders that in some cases expressly defied congressional intentions. Perhaps the most famous of these was what has been referred to as the midnight reserves, sort of like the midnight judges, back in the Adams administration. And this was in 1907, where Congress had an appropriations bill, and it had attached to the appropriations bill a rider saying no more national forest reserves in the West, because I mean, I don't have to tell you, but so much of Western lands is simply under the control of the federal government. There was I saw a map published recently in which Nevada, there's very little of Nevada that is really under the jurisdiction of Nevada. And for those of us in the East, this is an abstract matter, but out here it's much more tangible. So the night before he signed the order saying no more forest reserves in the West, he seized 16 million acres of timberland. This John Milton Cooper, who is certainly no critic of the progressives, called the most brazen act of his administration. And needless to say, Congress was not happy with this. Roosevelt, in the coal strike, had warned against what you might call the routinization of crises. Okay, I had to do this in the coal strike, but we can't let this become a model for future action. A crisis should never be some crises you should let go to waste. Well, that was his thought in 1902, but by 1907, he had had a change of heart. And so in the conservation movement itself, Roosevelt increasingly warned of a number of famines. These would be shortages in timber, coal, iron, mineral oil, and gas, and used all of these possible, probable, likely famines as a pretext for more action. This in itself is interesting, but what I found most interesting when I was doing my research was the theory that underlay this. And again, this is from the autobiography, and I'd like to, this is something that Herbert Knox Smith had written and that Roosevelt quoted approvingly. Of far more importance was the light that this history and the history of our other resources throws on the basic attitude of tradition and governmental beliefs of the American people. The whole standpoint of the people toward the proper aim of government, toward the relation of property to the citizen, to the relation of property to the government, were brought out first by this conservation work. So there you have it. In some way, when you can't directly, you can't get authorization, you don't have approval to act directly to address some of the economic issues facing the country, you have environmental, it wasn't called environmentalism then, it was the conservation movement. And there are significant differences between Roosevelt's conception of the conservation movement and today's environmentalists, chiefly turning on the question of whether or not to use resources. Roosevelt at least thought that resources, vital resources, should be exploited, should be developed, should be used, but he thought that only the government could use them wisely, with a view to the long-term public good of the country. He had no faith that any private lumber company, private company, oil company, steel company, really could act in the public interest. But he did think at least that resources should be developed, but developed by the government. So that's a difference between today's environmental movement. But the other side of it, what both things have in common, I think, is that they provide a way to get greater control over aspects of American life and over the economy, the way, and just all I need to do is ask you to think about the work of the current Environmental Protection Agency, and you see the way in which it's possible to really sink your tentacles into American life in the name of a noble cause, which is saving the environment. And on college campuses, I certainly know at Bowdoin, sustainability has become probably the great moral issue of the day. Okay, so I thought it was important to mention the theory that underlies the conservation movement. And the third of these three stewardship examples, this one comes from foreign policy, but it's also, I think, of immediate relevance. And this is the crisis in Santo Domingo, or the Dominican Republic, which occurred early in the first term of Roosevelt's administration. Roosevelt had, under the, I'm not going to give you the date because I can't remember which year it was, so pardon me for that. Roosevelt had issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Saying now, the Monroe Doctrine said it did not look favorably upon European nations coming into our sphere of influence in the New World. And what Roosevelt said is the United States is prepared to intervene in Central America and South America in order to keep these powers out. So we were now going to be taking positive steps to keep out the European powers. And the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo, was in dire economic straits, and European countries were threatening just to come in and take over its ports because they weren't delivering on their customs duties. So Roosevelt entered into an agreement with Santo Domingo to take over the collection of customs revenues to prevent European nations from moving into our sphere. But what happened was he negotiated this agreement, and then he submitted the treaty to the Senate, and the Senate refused to ratify it. So TR carried out his policy by executive order. And he comments on this in his autobiography. And there he said, speaking of the stewardship theory, which enabled him as the principal negotiator and representative spokesman for American interests in foreign policy, the president, to say the following: the Constitution did not explicitly give me power to bring about the necessary agreement with Santo Domingo, but the Constitution did not forbid me doing what I did. I put the agreement into effect, and I continued its execution for 2 years before the Senate acted. And I would have continued it until the end of my term, if necessary, without any action from Congress. Nevertheless, Roosevelt conceded that there were limits to this informal arrangement. It was far preferable that there should be action by Congress, he wrote, so that we might be proceeding under a treaty that was the law of the land and not merely be a direction of the chief executive, which would lapse when that particular executive took office. This is exactly the message that Senator Tom Cotton sent to the Iranian diplomats, and which caused such a stir 2 weeks ago. But here you have Roosevelt saying, it lapses. When I go, the next president can revoke this agreement. It's only an executive order. And Roosevelt learned that also in his conservation efforts. He went around at the end of the last week of his presidency declaring all kinds of bird refuges. But he did so, and the Congress refused to appropriate any money for these bird refuges, and after a while, they all just sort of dried up, and their refuge status was revoked. And so Roosevelt at least recognized the importance of the power of the purse, that Congress was a coordinate, co-equal branch of government, and it had the power to stop him. He could do things, but without the money to back it up, he couldn't really carry them through all that successfully. As I said at the beginning of my talk, although Roosevelt practiced his stewardship theory while president and gave many examples of his stewardship theory in his autobiography, he did not articulate this particular theory until 1910, and he did so first in his New Nationalism speech, although he really fleshed it out in his autobiography. But the stewardship theory was a key principle in his larger progressive vision. In the New Nationalism speech of 1910, he laid out, in addition to just mentioning the stewardship theory there, a different view of property rights and a new test for the legitimacy of property. What he announced there is that it was not enough that property be honestly acquired. It also had to benefit the community and render service to the nation as a whole. Some people, he said, had too much, and other people had too little. And it was now the job of the government to decide to rearrange the ships, the chairs on the deck, make sure that everybody had a decent seat, as it were. What he meant by benefit was really a very narrow, well, both broad and narrow conception of what benefit or service to the nation was. He did not mean the philanthropic institutions. Think Rockefeller University, think the founding of the University of Chicago, think all the great museums, the medical centers, all established with great philanthropic wealth in this country. He did not mean technological innovation. He did not mean an improvement or rise in the standard of living. He meant justice, social justice. That was his understanding of what it meant that you provided service and rendered benefit to the nation. This, of course, meant a new role for the courts. The courts were narrow, much too legalistic, much too bound to precedent and constitutional principles. We needed forward-looking men, and of course they were all men, to sit on the courts, men who had a new vision. And what Roosevelt called for was something that went well beyond what he dismissed as mere legal justice. He was concerned with ethical justice, with moral matters, or with social justice. To this end, he called for the recall of judicial decisions. This, of course, was his great undoing in the run-up to the 1912 election. This is what caused Elihu Root and Henry Cabot Lodge to break with him and say that they could not support him in the election. It was the attack on the courts. It was the attack on the courts that really did it for them. He said that it was the recall of state judicial decisions. And he spent months of his campaign after 1910 trying to walk back that disastrous policy proposal, but he didn't fool anyone. And in fact, in private letters, he hinted that he was perfectly prepared to see the principle of recall extended to the federal courts and even to the Supreme Court. He was also in favor, though this was less what he was concerned with, he did not rule out the recall of individual judges. So you have the recall of decisions. You don't like what the court has decided, there is a remedy for that. You don't have to, you can, in effect, the people can overrule court decisions within a certain period of time. He said it for 6 months, but then he was willing to wait 2 years. If the people were still opposed to this particular political decision 2 years later, then it could be repealed or recalled. And this was one of the greatest turning points in the run-up to the 1912 election. Of course, it wasn't just recall of judges that he favored. He also supported direct democracy. And again, out here in the West, you are the great beneficiaries of the Roosevelt reforms, both referenda and initiatives. They really did catch on. In the North, much less, and in the South, not so much at all. Of course, what Roosevelt thought is that if the people could act directly, and again, this is partly to circumvent the legislatures, which Roosevelt thought were thwarting the people's will. If the people could act directly, they would put in place new progressive measures. But as I learned many years ago at a Liberty Fund conference, the results have often been the case that the people have used referenda, recall of judges, and initiatives to undo progressive measures. The record of direct democracy advancing the progressive agenda is a very mixed one. It's often, direct democratic reforms have also been used to blunt or to repeal or to reverse progressive measures enacted by the legislature. So that's a kind of interesting business. Along with direct democracy, Roosevelt also favored the establishment of new administrative agencies that would help to carry out the policies of the executive branch. And the direct democracy reforms and the administrative agent and the growth of bureaucracy, the administrative state, these two things together constitute what I called in my book a kind of pincer movement against the original constitutional design, because both of them, the intention of both of them was in some way to thwart the working of the Constitution as the framers had envisioned it, because the Constitution as envisioned established the principle of the separation of powers and federalism. And both of these principles together made it difficult for someone as impatient and eager to act and as fired up with a vision of how to transform the country as Roosevelt was. These were just speed bumps, obstacles, and he was determined to find another road on which to drive that didn't have these speed bumps. And so this two-pronged attempt, one was beneath the representative organs of government, appeals to the people themselves, and then the other above, where you would have the administrative agencies issuing what, and of course this took a while to unwind. It didn't come into being full-blown during TR's administration. But what you would have are administrative agencies that issue rules that have the force of law. And once you are subject to those rules that have the force of law, these are executed and judged by the same people who are making the laws. There is really no separation of powers that operates, nor is there a great respect for federalism. So in part, these were methods of circumventing what was the original constitutional order. Roosevelt also called for a new social contract. And this is a hobby horse of mine, because so many times students learn that FDR in the Commonwealth Address of 1932 first called for a new social contract between the government and the people. And we all like to say, see, this is so different from the Declaration of Independence. But in fact, it wasn't FDR. FDR did do that. But FDR was plagiarizing from TR, who in the 1912 Progressive Party platform had also called for a new contract between the government and the people. And this contract would give the people more rights if the people would enter. It's a contract with the government. The government promises you more rights, economic rights, entitlements, and in exchange, you give the government more power so that it can give you more rights, including the power to levy income taxes, among other things. In all this, Theodore Roosevelt insisted that he was not attacking constitutionalism. You can see that this would have been a major issue, that he was no friend of constitutionalism. Roosevelt responded that he was an emphatic supporter of constitutionalism. What he opposed was the false constitutionalism that tricked the people out of their rights. His was the true constitutionalism. If all this sounds familiar, it is because these and others are the same issues that are kicking around today and continue to roil the political waters, where these really, our political disputes, our disagreements, all have their roots in some of the tensions that first emerged in the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. And I will stop there. Thank you. I'd like to start with students first. I can run this like a Quaker meeting.
Why don't you give them the answers? They can think of the questions.
Coraggio. Ryan.
Would you draw any distinction between, during the presidency, the use of presidential commissions and a somewhat different animal emerges later? Or maybe you can tell me it's not a different animal, but more independent administrative agencies. Because, of course, you could use a presidential commission as a sort of fact-finding or management recommending body and then have Congress ratify it or fund it. I mean, that's a different thing, I think, than what we've grown used to today.
These are the sorts of questions political theorists really hate. Because there's, you really do get into public policy questions, and so I don't really think that I want to tread too deeply into those waters. I think what you have, presidents who have agendas look for ways to advance them. Independent regulatory commissions are supposed to be independent of all the branches of government. The assumption is somehow that they will operate in an impartial fashion, that they will be able to gather together all of the best social science evidence and arrive at a policy that is somehow without any political consequences one way or the other. And it's an effort in some way to avoid the politics that inevitably affects every decision that a government makes. You are distributing benefits, you are taking benefits away from people, you're giving things to people, and Congress looked very shoddy doing that, so maybe the independent regulatory commissions could do it better. I'd say that they're, first cousins of each other. What all of them have in common is this belief that somehow you can rise above politics by getting people who just look, at this objective evidence in social science. But even in the conservation area, there's an old book by Samuel Hayes on the conservation movement, in which he points out that there were all kinds of political decisions that had to be made, and they were just too naive, really, to take that into account. I mean, if you decide that what you want is with the Hetch Hetchy Dam, for instance, a great example, you want to provide water. That means in some way that you aren't preserving the pristine environment. If you decide that you want land reclamation and you want to encourage agriculture, then you're diverting those resources from other equally plausible claimants. So you just sort of kick, in a way what happens is that you kick the can, especially I think with independent regulatory agencies, you kick the can further away from any accountability. So on the one hand, which is supposed to allow for enlightened policy, but it really just allows for no redress. So. Please, Lauren.
I'm wondering what Jeff Toulis in his book, The Rhetorical Presidency, defends Roosevelt's innovations on the ground that the class antagonisms that had been built up in the late 19th century had reached such a crisis point, akin to the crisis over slavery, that Roosevelt's innovations were justified. And I'm wondering what you think of that argument.
Not that much.
Yeah.
I actually discuss the rhetorical presidency in my book at some length. I basically subscribe. I think the idea in back of the rhetorical presidency is a very sound one, that there is a shift away from the president as someone who has to deal with Congress and the elected officials of the country, and now someone who is appealing to public opinion as a way to try to go over the heads of Congress. So you could say that direct democracy is the institutional embodiment, or direct democracy and the administrative agencies in some way are ways of trying to put into effect the wishes of the people against Congress. So I think the idea of the rhetorical presidency, that you are speaking to some group other than Congress, is a very sound one. But Toulis's point, let me say one thing that I agree with him. There was a crisis, and no one, and certainly not I, am standing up here trying to suggest that that Roosevelt should have stood pat for laissez-faire economics and no political interference ever at any time and in any place. But the problem that I have when I was writing this book, which took a long time, and it took a long time in part because there aren't any good sources to read in history. History has been written by progressives, and so progressives continue the story of how this was a crisis in the American Republic, and there were all these problems that needed to be solved, and the only way that you could solve them was by transforming the Republic. And there just aren't enough counter narratives. There aren't enough other sources that you can go to try to say, okay, if there was a crisis, was our constitutional system incapable of meeting the crisis? Were there ways in which we might have addressed the crisis which did not call for the transformation of the American political system? Because Roosevelt, as he was leaving the White House, it published 2 essays, Where We Can and Where We Cannot Work with the Socialists. And what Roosevelt meant, and this was while he was in the White House, was that he was not a Marxist. He was not in favor of violent class conflict. He was not in favor of the abolition of private property. But just about everything short of that, the democratic, peaceful socialism was certainly open to consideration. He said they were really just advanced liberals. It's a great line. So I would say that there was that social and economic conditions were had reached a critical point, and you could see that just in the growth of the Socialist Party in the United States in the early years of the 20th century. But what I can't do is just go to the leap that the alternative was simply the transformation. I also think that part of it is that it was so much, not that it's easy, but that it's easier to look to Woodrow Wilson and then make Roosevelt the good guy. Roosevelt's rhetoric was often very, on the one hand, on the other hand, I want a square deal. I'm not for the mob. I'm not for the plutocrats. I want to steer between Scylla and Charybdis. He always used that kind of language. And if you are a rhetorical president, that's pretty effective. But underneath it all, he increasingly was steering more toward the mob side of things. And what Toulis says is that he used demagoguery to counter demagoguery. But I would urge and have urged Jeff Toulis to go back and take a look at the entire record, because I think all that Toulis did was look at railroad rates. He looked at the enactment of the Hepburn Act. And he made that a kind of exception to Roosevelt's otherwise more moderate policies. That the Hepburn Act regulated railroad rates, and this was, and Toulis makes the argument that this in effect laid the foundation for the administrative state. It was the first time that we had stepped in to regulate any portion of the economy. But what Toulis didn't study, again, because his focus was on making Wilson the first rhetorical president, is that the Hepburn Act was just one of several of these big rhetorical pushes that Roosevelt made. The Conservation Act, the conservation movement was another great rhetorical effort. And even with the Hepburn Act was passed in 1905. And then Roosevelt said, it's a great first act. We must go further. And so then he went on a campaign to expand the other regulatory agencies, to give them even more power. So there's a lot, this was not just one singular interference in an otherwise moderate 8-year presidency. And I think that Toulis simply had his own reasons for wanting to make Wilson the inaugurator of the rhetorical presidency, and I've tried to argue that I think it started with Roosevelt. So, and you asked me a multi-pronged question, and I gave you a long-winded answer. Yes, please. As a what?
Researcher is here from Bowdoin. When you tell this story, when you tell it here, I think it's easy to sort of think that the trends are all one way. But there are some things you pointed to, even in Roosevelt's time, right? That his attack on the courts was politically harmful. And so what struck me is this, that around the same time in England, there's a similar crisis between progressivism and constitutional reform. That in the end, in order to, they do in fact transform the political order in order to get progressive or social democratic moves to take on. What happens afterward is that you never, on the one hand, the progressive agenda comes and goes. There's action and reaction, there are movements back and forth over the decades, but there's never any return to the constitutional reforms. There's never any sense that our problems with the policies have to do with changes in the regime that are undesirable and have to be undone. Or that we need to, and here that's not true. Here both the reforms themselves and the changes in the regime that these reforms thought were necessary are contested.
Are what?
Are continue to be contested, right? And in a way,
your take on why did TR have this experience of proposing regime changes and getting a political bloody nose? FDR had a similar experience. Truman had versions of this experience. There's something about popular constitutionalism that they, that for all their populism, they have a hard time relating to. What do you think that way?
I think that what I would say is that it is partly a question of the American character, that we have always been, or until it's arguable whether we still are, but I want to keep those sorts of comments out of this discussion, a liberty-loving people. And that is part of the thing that the progressives attacked as well. Individual rights, the commitment to individual rights, the commitment to liberty. They were more interested in equality. And I think there's just been more pushback. This is a big country. Again, Roosevelt said, in speaking of the American character, this was one of the things that drew me to Roosevelt in the first place. It was a positive attraction because he talked so much about the importance of the American character. It was just that the virtues that he came to embrace were not quite the same virtues, or to the extent that they were, he didn't quite see that the institutional changes that he proposed would actually subvert the character that he wanted to preserve. So I think part of the answer to why there is more pushback, and again, this is a big country. And another little factoid for Californians, Roosevelt thought that the great embodiment of the American character and the American spirit was the Westerner. Here was the person who was least, the most individualistic, and the most democratic, in some ways the most free. You don't have that in the smaller European societies. They come out of different traditions, they're smaller, they're more homogeneous. So I'd say that that's part of it. And then I would say the other part of it, which all the progressives took stabs at in different ways, was the Americans love the founders. They love Washington. They love the Federalist. Even Roosevelt in the 1880s and 1890s, the epigraph from my book is a quotation from Roosevelt where he says, "Read the Federalist. It is the best work on political theory and practice that has ever been written." But what I unpack in the book is that what he meant was that Madison, who wrote all those extended reflections on the large republic and did all his homework on federalism, these were people who were deeply steeped in theory, but they were also practical politicians. The particular theory of the Federalist, he had really, I think, only passing acquaintance with. I never could find a time in which he actually read the book himself. He certainly never read it at Harvard, where he had a very bizarre course in Anglo-American constitutional history. But Roosevelt notwithstanding, Americans are really, in part, a very patriotic and venerating people. They do like and admire their founders, and they don't particularly want people messing around with them. And that keeps coming back. It was what, gave so much force to the Reagan Revolution, which happened to coincide with the bicentennial of the Constitution. There was a perfect storm. And so there are times in American life when one returns and rediscovers the principles of the founders. And I don't think, if you don't have a written constitution, or your constitutions go out of fashion and are repealed or overthrown every 25 or 30 years, you are not going to have that kind of veneration for your founders. But there is a way, a popular way, in which there is a certain continuity that binds us back to them. That I think also exerts a strong pull. Of course, people have to be awakened to it, and people have to be educated so that they understand these things, which is why, when SDS, for instance, was talking about how it could hold on to or seize and then hold on to political power, they just dismissed the Democratic Party. That was irrelevant. What was really important, they wrote in 1962, is take over the universities. You get a diet of steady ideology, and you are going to produce generations of students who will march to that tune. It's worth thinking about. Yes?
Back to your comment about the Hepburn Act of 1905. That was, of course, an effort to deal with the monopolization of railroad rates, and it's one of many such examples of trusts that were growing arguably out of hand at the turn of the century, perhaps foremost Standard Oil, Rockefeller, and all that. And TR was very explicit in his dislike and his feeling that those did not serve the interests of the people. So I'm interested in your take, which is doesn't surface explicitly as one of the three examples that you cite, but it seems to me that was a very significant characterization of what he tried to use executive power to confront in the interest, in his perception, of the interests of the nation and the people.
I have a number of comments in response to your question, and it's a good question because I think that in a way it is that's what I would say is the kind of established view of what the progressives were all about. There was a problem, he wanted to solve it, and there were these trusts, and they were monsters, and they were strangling the American people. A couple of things. One is that I didn't discuss the Hepburn Act, although it is important. I discuss it at great length, some length, in my book. And I explore all the technicalities of it and go through the literature on the regulation of the railroads. The first thing is that the railroads, I make a distinction between the railroads and Standard Oil and all of the other, the trusts in the United States, because the railroads were public carriers invested with a public interest, and there was more argument for some kind of regulation in the public interest than there was for regulating the trusts. So you have to disaggregate these things. One is you have what the Hepburn Act did was to control the railroad lines, transportation. What Roosevelt then wanted to do was to use as a template for the industrial economy the model of the Hepburn Act. So, excuse me, may I have my water, please? Thank you. So there was a difference between regulating one sector of the economy and regulating a different sector and applying the same principles. The other thing is that the Hepburn Act, because it laid the foundation for the government to regulate railroad rates or set limits to railroad rates, it then led to much greater regulation of the railroads. And Yarbrough Martin, in his book on the railroads, argues that ultimately it was regulation that killed the railroad industry in this country. It simply couldn't compete against unregulated industries as cars and trucks began to be developed. So regulation in the end wound up just killing the railroads. So that's with the railroads. And then the other is just that what was done with the railroads, in some sense, could not be just simply applied to the rest of the industrial economy. And then you have the question of, and this was one of the big questions that divided the progressives, is antitrust better than regulation? Which of these two methods is better? And Roosevelt came very heavily, I cite quite heavily in my book the arguments of Martin Schklar, who's a socialist, a man of the left, who died recently and wrote just a wonderfully informative but very dense book on industrial capitalism. And he looks at the policies of TR and Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft, and shows in painstaking but painful detail that Roosevelt was really a top-down statist, and that even his most stalwart progressive allies began to sort of draw back from this, because he came down with both feet on the side of regulation and against antitrust matters. And you can see how that, if you're interested in it, I would really steer you toward that, or you can get the shorter version in my book, which distills it.
Most of our problems, in some sense, stem from the contemporary things we were dealing with in big politics, stem really from TR's understanding of both the administrative state and executive power. But when we think about the executive power part, are there presidents recently who don't really, in some sense, share Teddy Roosevelt's understanding of executive power? I mean, is it sort of, an alternate understanding kind of lost? I don't mean just, certain aspects. If you think of certain aspects from the Republican Party these days who might not, but are there actual presidents in the last several decades who don't, in the end, really, in some sense, share the Teddy Roosevelt view of executive power?
Maybe Gerald Ford. Well, what I said was the stewardship theory of the presidency is a very seductive theory. You can't come right out and say that you support it. E.S. Corwin had a wonderful quip about it when he called it the stewardship theory of presidential power. So you don't want to come out and just claim that you have unlimited power to do anything that you, in your own sweet way, think is good for the American people. But the active presidency, and also this idea that you're the dominant one, you're vigorous and energetic. I mean, the whole psychological dimension of presidential power. Who wants to be the timid, shrinking, shirking soul? In answer to the penultimate question, or to expand on the penultimate question that the researcher, posed, you can't just go back. I mean, Sid Milkis makes the point, and I'm indebted to him as I end my own book, that these extra constitutional forms are now part of the political culture in which we live. And the best you can do is hope that you can use some of them to undo some of the things you don't like. But it's very hard to imagine that people are going to just get rid of direct democracy, or that the administrative state Philip Hamburger notwithstanding, is just going to be declared illegal, unlawful.